They built a giant gun. Again. But no, this was different. Not like the other giant gun they built or that other giant gun they built that other time. Why? I asked simply. Why not? Came the simple response, and I was led on a tour. Under most circumstances, we would simply be inspecting the planet's defenses, making sure they simply were up to code, and couldn't shatter a planet accidentally 10,000 years from now, to make sure their targeting systems would not miss, to make sure they couldn't cause any severe collateral damage. Humans were a different breed of beast. They made absolutely sure that every single gun could shatter a star in half and never miss. This was nothing but stupid. Even for humans, this was a dumb concept, a dumb execution, just plain fucking dumb. I was shown around the structure and they pointed at the stock of the giant gun. I simply looked at him and asked why. He simply smiled and said, why not? He showed me the giant mechanical arm they crafted out of a Starship factory assembly mechanism. He showed me how it pulled the giant gun's trigger and performed various loading actions, including a demonstration of how it was used to remove a jam. I looked at him and asked him why. He smiled and simply said, why not? He showed me the way the barrel was made and how the barrel had to be replaced after so many shells were fired. He told me the shells it fired were 30-inch high explosive shells. He showed me the firing mechanism and explained how it worked. I looked at him and asked him why. He simply smiled and said, why not? He then showed me the loading mechanism, an obscenely complicated, gigantic mechanical arm mimicking the movements of a human arm as they demonstrated the way the gun was loaded. A giant clip of ammunition weighing hundreds of tons is lifted a quarter-mile off the ground and slid into a chamber on top of the gun. The bullets are then pushed down by the giant mechanical finger, and the weapon is loaded as the 3-ton clip is discarded to the left. I looked at him and asked, why? He simply looked at me and said, why not? He then handed me the button to fire with a smile. If you tell me you don't want to see this thing fire, I will look you in your eyes and call you a liar. I sighed. I once again asked why, only to receive a smile as I pushed the button. The giant gun fired, and the massive amount of recoil from the 30-inch shell made the whole platform shudder, and the gun moved back about 30 feet before the catching mechanism forced it forward again. In quick succession, the gun fired 7 more shells, the process repeating to the happy sounds of every human in the area squealing with delight. The last shell fired let out a sudden loud metallic noise, like a giant sword being hit by a giant tuning fork. The empty casings from the shells blasted out the right side and dented the ground they landed on, pooling in a huge hole in the ground where a massive 60-ton crane was waiting to collect them. I looked at him and asked him why. He simply smiled back and said, why not? At an annoyingly loud volume. I watched with morbid fascination as the enormous monstrosity was loaded again with the giant mechanical arm. I held my head in my hands, out of sheer despair at this point, as I looked at the amount of shells that were ready to fire. I heard a human voice appear behind me. What the hell's going on here? It was the human admiral, the commander of the military garrison in charge of the sector. He took one look at the weapon in front of him and held his head in his hands as well. He stayed there for a few moments and let out a silly, annoyed chuckle. Did you seriously build a giant 30-inch M1 Garand? He asked them as he looked at me. Yep! They all smiled at him as if they genuinely accomplished something important. He stood beside me as I slowly lowered my head. I looked at him, disappointed. I sighed and officially gave up, slowly raising my hand to let him have a turn with the big red button. Like an excited child, he pressed it and the weapon went through its firing sequence, ending with a grand and glorious ping. Once again, the assembled crowd cheered with glee, letting out a mighty "Oorah!" as the gun pinged. One final time I asked them why. They simply responded, why not? Sometime later. Why did they do this? It was bad enough they did it the first time I was here. Now they did it again. Only a lot worse this time. A lot worse. Apparently it needs to be a galactic law to never, ever leave a human engineer alone for too great a period of time, especially when they have access to a great quantity of resources. Apparently they also learned from the mistakes of their last attempt and made it so this one can actually do its job effectively, which by itself is both terrifying and also inspiring. No, I take that back. It's just fucking terrifying. I often wonder why the gods created humanity. Was it to test us? Was it to laugh at us? Since I started this commission, I often find myself conflicted with a multitude of emotions. Fear, anger, annoyance, irritation, awe, shock, amazement. I feel all this, all the time, every time I deal with these insane apes. I am both thankful a species with such incredible capability is our ally, and infuriated that this is what they do with that capability. I looked at the Navy Admiral next to me. He was just as done as I was this time. Guys, You can't tell me you seriously have this much extra crap to spare to build these, he said, still holding his head in his hands. Well, yeah, we do. You'd be surprised what you can do with a huge scrapyard. Besides, it's hand-me-down mats from derelicts and ancient ships. It isn't like we're spending billions of credits for it, one of the engineers proudly said, still holding a wrench. But that doesn't mean, you know what, screw it. Is this one actually practical, especially at this size? And why two of them? He asked. Yes it is, and because reasons. The engineer replied with a smirk. Care to elaborate on those reasons? I asked, finally breaking from my momentary despair. Because reasons, he replied sheepishly and backed away. The Admiral looked at me. So, you want the first shot, or should I? He said as he held up the big red button. I sighed, rolled my eyes, and pressed the big red button. I pressed it for 3 seconds, and it let out a sequence of 5 ridiculously rapid bursts. Each burst firing 10 of its 7.9 2-inch shells. The side of the gun had a belt of several thousand of the damn things that the gun greedily sucked up. A massive pit nearby, dug almost a half-mile deep, caught every shell that it expended, each one hitting the ground with a hollow clang. The gun itself let off a sound that was more a deafening, constant roar of fire, rather than the singular explosions and massive booms of the first one they built. The firing platform they built almost perfectly absorbed the recoil the gun had, a combination of both its giant bipod stabilizing it and a massive mechanism holding it firmly in place. It was a machine gun from back in the day, apparently a gun that was responsible for the most casualties in a single battle. Now I understand why. The atmosphere warped and twisted as the gun fired its shells, the shockwaves from the barrel making the atmosphere angrily twist and swirl around it. I pressed the button solid for 20 seconds. It fired full auto this time, letting out a massive blast of its shells. Too many, too fast to even count. 20 seconds of deafening, merciless fire. By the time it stopped firing, the pit for the shell casings was half full. One of the engineers approached us and smiled. Cool, huh? MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, he said with a smirk. Well, yeah. How often does the mechanism and barrel need to be replaced with this one? I asked, aware my ears were now ringing ever so slightly. Never. Can handle a full 2,000-round full auto fire. We have a slightly more sophisticated and less flashy way of working with this one. Simple load and fire, usually box mag. Sometimes the belts get stuck. Can pretty much use it anywhere we need to. The barrel and majority of the assembly is made of nanocarbon, which is starship material, which means this thing can handle almost anything. And, check this out, he said and stepped back. He depressed some levers and set some switches on a control panel. The entire assembly moved up by about 20 feet. The platform holding the gun swiveled left 20 degrees, then moved up, aiming almost completely upwards. This one can actually be used for planetary defense. Unlike the Garand we built, this one can actually fire at ships. And we actually tested it on a Telestar and Dreadnought, he said with a sly smirk. I snapped my neck to look at him so hard I'd swear I broke something. You what? Myself and the Admiral both said at once. He simply chuckled and pressed a button. A television screen appeared out of the platform and played a video. While the humans were busy calibrating their giant gun, a Telestar and Dreadnought, one of the largest and most heavily armed warships of the 12 races, appeared and attempted to take the star system. They didn't get very far as the gun fired a full burst of 700 rounds in quick succession, a veritable beam of solid projectiles coming from the planet's surface. Any ship of any kind would fail under those conditions. I watched in terrified awe as the Dreadnought started being pelted by a stream of hundreds of projectiles. The shields failed, and the armor was now denting, paint scratching and turrets being blown apart by explosive shell impacts. The television also allowed audio, and I cradled my head in my hands at the sounds of the crew panicking, believing they were under attack by a massive fleet. When the stream of bullets finally stopped, the Dreadnought was held together by wishes and good vibes, barely functioning as the ship captain opened his comms and begged surrender. We were going to just turn it into Swiss cheese, but we kind of ran out of ammo. That was the first firing test. It did pretty good, but we fixed a few errors and made it better. The engineer said, smirking. Crazy damned humans. A gravelly voice nearby said. The Admiral and I looked to our right, now noticing the Telestaran Admiral Kohokuru, flanked by 2 legionnaires, his 4 hands in cuffs. Kohokuru, God, this is embarrassing, I said to him with a definite smirk. Gods above, please tell me they didn't do anything more than this. I don't think the galaxy can stand it, I yelled out in frustration. So, does that mean you don't want to see the 8-inch Jiao 80 CI doubles we built then? Some panic days later. If I did not directly ask for it, I would be holding my head in my hands and asking the gods why. The crazy bastards did it again, only worse, a lot worse. Thankfully, this time it was actually a request. The Emperor, however, was not so enthusiastic as I was. He stood next to me, his concubines hiding behind his regal form in terror at the human starship sitting in dry dock in front of us. It looked like well, since it is likely humans will read this, the ship is a slightly fancier version of the Imperial Gladiator class cruiser, only in the standard Terran Union color pattern and ballistic or railguns instead of, what were those called? Turbo lasers. Doesn't matter. They probably have those turbo laser things around somewhere. I wouldn't be surprised at this point. Crazy apes. This one was called a Sentry Cruiser, and the humans who built it called it a giant CIW's turret with starship engines. From what I can tell, the damn thing was majority engines and ammunition, with a crew of 7 people. 7. For a cruiser. A ship class normally reserved for crews of up to 500 members. This damn thing only has 7. Because, and I quote, "If we tried to increase the crew quantity, we'd get rid of too much ammunition." The Emperor looked at me, and then the ship with a marked absence of patience. I showed him the giant M1 Garand. His expression went from calm and stoic to, "What the actual hell?" I then showed him the giant MG-42, then handed him an enemy fleet admiral, and the remains of one of the deadliest ships in the galaxy turned into Swiss cheese. His expression became a mixture of terror and rage. I'm not sure which was more prominent. Now, here we stand in front of a giant turret with engines, ready for it to face its first test fire. The Emperor's expression now a mixture of both a loss of patience and a loss of temper. The human engineers, hell, even the human admiral, were staring at the glass, salivating at the sight of this ridiculous beast. Mounted on the front, directly in the ship's front portion, where there should be a hangar apparently, was a gun with 8 barrels. I looked to my left, and the sight of an engineer with an absurdly terrifying smile standing just a bit too close made me jump out of my socks. Yes, we Eridani do wear socks. Humans, stop giggling. I know you are. I regained my footing and growled angrily at the overly excited ape. "Hey, dude, hey. Nice, huh?" He let out a disturbing laugh. "This is the GAU-80, an 8-inch GO8 CI-WOWS, swivel mounted directly to the front for 8-degree motion." I just looked at him, put my head in my hands, and said, "Why?" "Well, you did ask for a heavy defense satellite. What the hell did you want? You explicitly stated you wanted a practical, self-sustaining variant of a defensive satellite that you could use to defend your planets or critical locations. So we delivered," he said. "How in the blazing—" The rest of my statement was purposefully censored by my translation unit. My rant continued for a full 10 minutes, most of it being expletives that not even humanity's barbarian ancestors would have used. When my rant ended, I looked around to find blushing cheeks, jaws on floors, and the Emperor himself looking at me in absolute disgust. I looked around the room and held out my hands. "Well, it is still true," I exclaimed angrily and impatiently tapped my foot on the floor with my arms crossed. "Does this thing even work? I mean, how can it work?" the Emperor asked. "Yeah, she's been test-fired before, only for a few seconds. She's built with a prototype inertial dampening drive, so she can absorb the recoil," the engineer said, pointing at small domes on the ship's hull. "I'm sorry, what?" "Inertial dampeners," I said. "Well, yeah, of course. 8-inch shells with a 5,000 revolutions per minute fire rate. We kind of have to have some dampening system to reduce and absorb recoil. That thing has some serious recoil, so we have to install inertia control systems so it doesn't fly backwards when it fires," he explained calmly. Both myself and the Emperor were wide-eyed now with the prospect of humanity successfully creating inertia dampening systems for large-scale warships, and also terrified that this shit is what they did with them. Out of curiosity, these inertia dampeners, have they been tested yet? I asked. "Well, yeah. Every starship in the fleet has them. I think it's like Gen 5 tech so far. They're mostly used for general-purpose ship movements. Normally, we wouldn't use them for this, but Big DACA requires a big bipod. That's basically what the inertia dampening coils are on this thing. Recoil absorption. It's essentially a giant bipod in stock, just really, really fancy," he said simply and used his holoscreen to show us an older technical blueprint of one. Both the Emperor and I took a deep, frustrated breath. "Okay, we will talk to you about the dampeners later. First, let's see this thing work. Does it have a target, or are you just shooting into space?" the Emperor asked. "Oh, hell no, we got a target. These aren't just standard chemical shell casing. It's a full rotary Gauss-assisted network. It's a GAU 80-inch rotary Gauss cannon," he said. We both looked at him like we'd just seen a ghost. "Don't give me that look," he said, scowled at us, and walked away to the control terminal. So how this works is a Gauss-assisted chemical projectile system. First, a mechanism sends a jolt of energy through a standard Gauss capacitor array in each barrel, then starts the spin. The chemical propellant ignites in the chamber, then gets sent out into the barrel. The Gauss effect then propels the projectile to 5% the speed of light. The small 8-inch slug hits a target with a force of about 8 kilotons of force, the engineer explained as he readied the firing sequence. "Wait, kilotons? Aren't those the measurements for nuclear detonations?" The Emperor squealed in horror. "Well, yeah." The engineer just smiled at us like it was nothing. 8 kilotons isn't much to speak of, to be frank. Most of our ships have warheads in the 25 to 35 megaton yields. That's just the middle distance, though. The TSU New York carries a 185 megaton fusion warhead in its missile bay, he said simply and readied the console. All of the life and soul we had drained from both myself and the Emperor as our skin went pale. The Emperor and I shared a look of petrified fear and made a mental note to visit a temple to pray to whoever we could think of at the time. Even Rakandus, the god of war, would be scared right now. We didn't know exactly who to pray to. Well then, here we go. Primary target, the Lumos asteroid field. Worthless for mining, but great target practice for miners. Pretty good choice, and done. Okay, the engineer said as he typed on the console. "This is Scabbard, ready for fire mission." The radio chimed. "Scabbard, this is Coldheart. Fire mission clear. Strike location sent. Burst fire, 3 seconds, 3 volleys. How copy?" The engineer spoke. A few seconds of silence passed. "Copy fire mission location 22A3.023B. Volley shot 3 seconds, sweep shot by 2 degrees, fire for effect," came the reply. The ship fired itself up, and we all felt the massive beast clunk loose from its moorings. It moved a few hundred meters forward out of its dock and aimed itself at an asteroid field. The barrel mechanism spun itself to ridiculous speed. A perfect cylinder of whirring metal could be seen. The ship's rear engines fired to full throttle with the gun as they let loose the gates of hell. It was a solid beam of projectiles. If I didn't know better, I would swear this was a laser cannon. It fired 3 bursts in rapid succession, the ship moving barely inches as it spat out condensed metal alloy fragments. It suddenly stopped. Winchester, 12 seconds. 13 seconds later, there was no asteroid field. They erased it, out of existence. A bright flash of nuclear light, and then there was nothing but the cold, mildly irradiated empty void. Myself, the Emperor, and his entire retinue then proceeded to pass out. The next few months were spent in secret, talking to the Galactic Council. Upon hearing the yield of their most powerful nuclear weapons, and the fact that every human ship in the void had at least 1 warhead, the Saranise's longest and most ancient enemy, the Rakandi, surrendered to the Terran Union. If the Saranai did not already have a treaty of alliance with the humans, we likely would have surrendered too. And before you ask, yes, I was allowed to push the big button after I regained consciousness. Bolts of plasma and laser fire darted across the void of space above one of our colony worlds, as our grand fleet fought hard to defend an Alliance colony world. A minor civil war within the Terranian Imperium, resulting in a full-blown galactic conflict. If an ally of the Eridani were not directly on their doorstep, this would be quite enlightening to see. I have always hated war. Maybe that's why humans make me so angry, or nervous, or whatever those emotions are. I looked at my fleet admiral, who was concentrating so heavily on tactical readouts, ordering retreats for badly damaged ships, trying to flank the enemy fleet, or becoming angry when an attempted surprise attack failed. Space combat is slow, lumbering, with ships in the several hundreds of thousands of tons each. Space combat can last weeks with enough ships. And here, the gateway to the core, there were thousands. If I wasn't so scared, I would be in awe at the sheer numbers of warships present. The Terranian Imperium were secretly building thousands of warships behind the scenes for decades. Now, they were unleashing all of it here. A bright flash of light toward the fleet's front line marks the final moments of a Saranai battlecruiser. The fleet admiral's tone grows more desperate, more calculated. We have assembled every council warship we could find in short notice, some of the best, in fact. But the sheer volume of enemy fire is overwhelming us. Every Terranian ship we destroy is replaced by 3 more. Everybody knows it. We can't hold for much longer. I look at the fleet admiral, who responds in kind. The expression on his face says everything. "We won't win this fight." "My Lord Admiral, capital-class starship incoming. Reactor signatures say it's a human warship." One of the crew yelled out from his pulpit on the bridge. "Humans? They aren't a part of this conflict. They aren't even on the council. What are they doing here?" The admiral barked out in anger. Too late to say anything about it. A human warship suddenly decelerated into the system. First suddenly stood on end. Paw pads began to copiously sweat. Spines began to rattle. Jaws hit the floor. Ink stained the walls. Brains suddenly stopped working. The ship that warped into the system was a massive mega beast, many times the size of our largest dreadnought. It flew at the speed of a large cruiser and quickly logged itself into our IFF system. It was beyond absurd how many weapons were coating that thing's hull. It was a ship design I recognized, however. It was the shape of I believe the ship's name was a Venator-class cruiser, although very highly modified, of course. When working with humans, I was required to visit many of their works of fiction in order to understand their mindset. I never did understand, of course, but the so-called Star Wars universe was an entertaining piece of media. The Admiral was happy about the reinforcements and quickly rallied his forces together, transmitting the necessary files to the humans after registering them with our ident system. I took a good look at that ship. Then I held my head in my hands out of sheer despair. Oh gods, no. No gods, why? They're going to fire that damn thing, I yelled aloud in absolute despair. The Admiral looked at me quizzically. What are you talking about? They're here to help us. Be thankful. I could not say anything except let out a loud cry of frustrated despair and slap my head with the palm of my hands, repeatedly screaming, why, as I did. The Admiral called for a medical crew as I dropped to my knees and began to pray fervently that the Turanian Empire would surrender as fast as possible. I begged and pleaded to whatever god could hear me to get through to the damn humans and ask them to not continue. It was too late. The large black paint-coated warship stood out of the firing range of the Turanian fleet and aimed its front end at the enemy. The ship began to defend itself from errant laser and missile fire. One of its huge battleship cannon turrets mounted on the top, swatting a battle cruiser out of the sky like an insignificant insect. Any enemy ship foolish enough to think it stands a chance is vaporized by any one of 100 capital ship weapons or overpowered high-velocity point defense turrets. The engines of the ship lit up like a massive firestorm as the reactor inside it roared to life. The ship's trim, exterior, and massive amounts of internal piping suddenly became visible like rivers of ghostly neon, flickering and flowing across its hull. A wave of energy coalesced around the ship, flowing through the pipes and cables across its massive hull, all converging towards a central point under the bridge. The spinal-mounted cannon that easily took up half of the ship's near 10-kilometer length marked the presence of a massive railgun array of some kind. I became a bit sick to my stomach on the notion of how large a slug would be used in that thing, and having seen human weaponry before, I began to vomit profusely. The giant Garand, the giant MG-42, the giant CIWS, and now this, the entirety of space, the literal void itself, suddenly warped as if an eldritch demon screamed in agony as the weapon fired. In my agitated state, my mind slowed such that I could literally see the blistering tendrils of a beast of the unknown reaching out in agony toward the universe. The Gwyn fired, and the void itself seemed to shudder at the action. The speed that Rail Slug was fired defied the very laws of nature itself, warping the very fabric of reality around it within a split millisecond. It blew past the entire fleet, straight through the formation, and for a few short moments, there was nothing. The wave of death suddenly began in parts. Any ship within 5 kilometers of the slug's passage through reality suffered being torn apart, being ripped to pieces, or being pixelated into oblivion, then disintegrating. Any ship within the 5 to 15 kilometer range suffered catastrophic malfunctions and engine failures, turrets detonating, reactors exploding, ship hulls warping to catastrophic failure, or other ships simply ceasing to function owing to disastrous EMP overload. Any ship within 15 to 50 kilometers escaped complete destruction, but suffered severe hull breaches, reactor malfunctions, or severe electronic disruption. A bright, blinding flash microseconds later marked the end of the slug's existence, as a void pulse sent it out of the universe, disintegrating it among the cosmic dust of the universe, so it would trouble no one after its deadly journey. Half of the Turanian fleet was damaged, destroyed, or simply gone. This entire sequence took less than 7 seconds to complete. 7 damned seconds. I shoved the medical crew out of my way and pulled the poor unfortunate communications officer out of his seat. I sat down, grabbing the headset, still in tears from a massive mixture of emotions, from frustration and despair to outright terrified fear. I opened every comms channel I could find and began to desperately scream a message. Humans, please listen. Please, we surrender. We surrender. We will do anything. Please just stop making giant guns, I pleaded into the radio. I continued to beg and plead, repeating the same message for as long as I could before I passed out from exhaustion. Many days later, pretty much half the galaxy were in negotiations with the humans, threatening sanctions and other things, or outright begging them to stop their crazy antics. The Saranai, on the other hand, were all in temples and drug-addled sermons, begging whatever gods we could find to explain to us why they created humans. The only answer we ever got was psychotic laughter, just endless, happy, giggling, psychotic laughing. Even more days later, the council was in talks, as usual. I had to take a break from ambassadorial work with the Terrans and start working in a more calming and controlled atmosphere. I smiled to myself as a slur was thrown about, causing an uproar. A huge groan of anger and resentment suddenly overcame the room as a Terranian and Olivarchian stabbed each other with word swords and angry remarks. A delightful, petty dispute on mining rights on a border world. I breathed a deep sigh of relief and sank into my seat. The ambassador from the Zarin delegation next door noticed and asked me what I was so calm about. Oh, it's nothing. It's good to get back to basics. Petty squabbles, childish bullying, silly conflicts. It never goes anywhere. It's just so relaxing, I said proudly. You find this idiotic nonsense relaxing. We're on the brink of war for the umpteenth time and you're relaxed. His mandibles clicked in confusion. Oh yes, trust me, compared to dealing with humans, this is a spa vacation. Humans and their ridiculous weaponry gave us all constant headaches. I sat back in my chair and laughed at yet another racial slur. The back and forth continued as it usually did for a few more minutes. I just sat and basked in the relaxed atmosphere of political debate. A strange noise came from behind me. The door opened, and the room was suddenly overcome by the horrible, desperate, despair-filled wailing of a Shikandi hive prince. A horrid blue goop flowed like rivers from his 6 eyes as his crabby form stumbled into my delegation pod and handed me a datapad. He gobbled and gabbled, barely attempting to snort out a coherent statement from his crying face as he just slumped into the corner and resumed his despair. The chamber just looked on expectantly and stared at me, waiting as the Shikandi began using his head as a hammer against the wall. Howie diddy dawa! Was all I could manage to understand from his horrendous wailing. I read the report on the datapad. As I read through each line, my skin tone went from a deep ocean blue to an almost pale snow white. I sank back into my seat and panic began to set in. My hands started shaking, so violently shaking that I couldn't read and had to stop for a few moments. I stood up from my seat and tried to calm down, wrapping my arms around myself to try to stop the shaking. The entire time this was happening, the council was at the edge of their seats, staring at me and trying to figure out what horror story I was reading. I sat back down, having regained my composure, but not my skin pigments, and resumed reading. I finished and was slightly relieved at the outcome, but not so much its implication. I had stopped shaking. But I was still white with shock. I looked at my now pale arm and squealed in panic for a minute as I lost the beautiful blue. I had literally had the color in my skin shocked out of me. I stood up and moved our podium into the speaker's corner, shoving the previous delegate out of it, and began to read the datapad aloud. To the Shikandi Hive Queen. From the Terran Union. This letter is to inform you that we have conducted a test with an experimental weapon codenamed Scion. The test firing of this experimental weapon has produced some interesting results, to say the least. Firstly, the information we gained confirmed the existence of gods in the astral plane. Who'da thunk it, huh? Secondly, the weapons test confirmed that the fabric of reality is slightly more permeable than initially expected, and gods can in fact be harmed by mortal weapons, given enough encouragement. Therefore, we are afraid we have some bad news. We have, through various experiments and a few seances, confirmed the existence of the Shikandi god known as the Great Devourer. We regret to inform you, however, our weapons test was unfortunately a lot more potent than expected, and the Great Devourer was accidentally destroyed/killed/annihilated during the test. Yes, you did read that correctly. We accidentally killed your god. Emphasis on accidentally. We had a minor miscalculation in our test weapons power and, well, the results speak for themselves. We sincerely apologize and hope that this event does not affect any future relations with your empire. We are fully committed to repairing any damage caused by this mistaken judgment, and will listen to any requests you have to mend the damage we have done. First step in this process is, of course, to dismantle the weapon in question and cease all research efforts into that kind of technology. This has, of course, already been done. We will be looking forward to any notices from your people in the coming days. With love, the Terran Union of Systems. P.S. Please do enjoy the basket of goodies we sent you as an apology. Many more to come. PPS. Oops. I finished reading the page aloud and noticed the Shakandi prince had stopped blubbering and was now half crying, half laughing as he devoured a small fabric fiber basket of foodstuffs. Diffif goob, diffif very goob, he said between mouthfuls and sobs. I sat back down in my seat and allowed a solid hour of deafening silence to follow my reading. Jaws were on the floor, paw pads were now soaked in sweat, carapaces were showing microfractures from stress, stretch marks were appearing on skins. For a solid damn hour, the room lay deathly silent, permeated only by the sobs and scrunching noises from a depressed hive prince. Finally, someone broke the silence. What do we do now? Nothing. We do nothing. There is nothing we can do, could do, or would do. They just killed a god. What can we do? Another councilman angrily responded. Quiet, I bellowed angrily. Dear delegates, there is no need for panic. I know my appearance denotes otherwise, but I assure you there is no need to panic. It says so right here. I attached the datapad with the letter to council chambers and highlighted a particular passage. First step in this process is, of course, to dismantle the weapon in question and cease all research efforts into that kind of technology. This has, of course, already been done. The humans are absolutely batshit doodly insane, but they aren't stupid. They know how bad they did, and they dismantled their giant god-killing gun and won't do it again. We have nothing to worry about, I assure you, I said. I allowed my message to sink in and sat back in my seat with a smile. My demeanor change seemed to calm everyone down, and within a few hours, we were back to our own petty squabbles. I messaged the Terran ambassador and asked if he did indeed dismantle the Godkiller cannon. He said yes, and all documentation has been shelved for now. I let out a loud squeal of terror and passed out as I read the words. But it's okay. We already have an attack moon being built. It's a lot more stable. Well, the final evolution of the giant gun. I knew it was coming, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think it existed. After the last time their giant gun accidentally killed a god, I didn't want to believe it. But there it is, an attack moon. I stood at the viewing port of the station orbiting their now fully functioning prototype, a medium-sized moon, its front end with a giant goddamn cannon on the front. I took a deep breath and looked at the engineer who designed it. Well, I guess it was inevitable then. So, what does this one do? Mobile Intelligence Stellar Ignition Unit, MISU. It can destroy a planet, but we'd rather find failed stars and use it to restart them, he said. This caught me off guard, and I looked at him surprised. Wait, it's not a giant death machine? Well, it is, but we'd rather use it for more creative purposes. There's thousands of systems around that have brown dwarfs or failed gas giants that have their own subsystems. By using this to ignite the fusion processes in these failed stars, we can make terraforming these planets and moons a lot easier, he replied with a smile. Oh, thank the gods, I tried to say. It can shatter a planet in half or blow away a gas giant atmosphere, or it can cause a supernova, and also maybe harvest matter from a neutron star too. But we don't really want to, so it won't, he said. I screamed, slamming my head into the window. He just looked at me in confusion. Yeah, anyway, it uses a miniature wormhole as a power source, and the shields... You did what with a wormhole? I yelled out in terror, staring at him. You don't have one? We create a small black hole using a matter collider, then use a special machine we use to turn it into a wormhole. Then we build a ship around it. The wormhole is calibrated, juiced, so we can effectively use it as a supply depot, as well as the ship's power plant. Even so, the planet itself has farms, factories, and everything else. It's fully self-sustaining, he simply said. You are talking to me like the entire galaxy can capture black holes and turn them into giant guns at will. The galaxy isn't as crazy as you are you. My translator began to censor a large number of expletives and slurs. The human just looked at me with a smirk as I ranted at him. In between the massive amount of slurs I managed to get in a few statements that actually made sense. I explained sort of how humans were insane for their obsession with big things. I explained how massive waveform reality-shattering railguns were an extremely uncommon occurrence. I explained how the galaxy did not have giant moving moon-based cannon ships. I explained with a large amount of swearing how humans were so far above the galaxy's level, it was honestly disgusting. I finished my rant and stared at him. How do you justify anything you do? This isn't about an obsession with enormous weaponry. What the hell are you doing? What do you mean? We're just doing what we have always done. Longer, farther, faster. That's basically our entire history. He simply said, still smirking. I took a deep breath. Okay, may I please, on behalf of all sentient life in the galaxy, please ask you humans to do one thing for us? Uh, sure? Please don't build a giant gun that will destroy the universe, I yelled out, my voice now becoming strained from my screeching. Oh, He looked at the ground sheepishly and rubbed the back of his neck with the hand. I guess I'll tell the Mars boys to stop building that quantum accelerator railgun then. Ha 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 ha! I yelled and spat more expletives and slurs, along with more breathless explanations of why humans are so insane. I gathered my breath after a solid hour of ranting at them all, a crowd of humans gathering around me as I detailed word for word as to why everyone was so irritated at them. I explained how the warrior caste of the Shakandi were so terrified of humans and their gun obsession that they nearly became Buddhist pacifists. I yelled at them all, explaining how the galaxy has repeatedly come to the conclusion the species needs to be censured or sanctioned, only for us all to do a double take and think it's a bad idea, as humans test fire giant gun number 384. Between expletives, curses, prayers to my gods, if humans had not already killed them anyway, we aren't sure, and racial slurs, I was rapidly running out of breath and developing a migraine. But I soldiered on and continued to explain why the galaxy was so terrifying and how we were concerned they might do something drastic or even crazier and end up all exploding or something. At the end of my rant, one human shyly raised a hand in question. Yes, I responded. So, does that mean we need to stop building the star cannon thingy? He asked. Everyone looked at him, shushing him angrily. I took a deep breath. What? Everyone tried to look away like they knew they were in trouble, doing that all too human thing when they look at the floor, rubbing the back of the neck. Well, you turned a star into a giant gun? I yelled. Well, not really. We kind of accidentally turned a gas giant into a neutron star and thought, well, I have an idea, and tried to harvest the neutron star for materials and kind of opened up a wormhole. One thing led to another, and we kind of built that. Then we thought, I can make it bigger, I guess, and, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not surprised, to be honest with you. Fucking creatures have this strange power to distort reality if you have a big enough cannon, but it still doesn't make any sense. What next? Ships shaped like giant guns being used by giant robots? I yelled at them. They all looked at each other in that asterisk way and shuffled closer to the blinds, closing them, just as I saw the silhouette of a giant ship in the shape of a human gun called the AK-47. No? I slammed my head into the wall again, slinging curses and slurs as I did. I looked up at the ceiling. I prayed to the gods. So, dear gods, are you guys still laughing? Are you still laughing? I screamed. So, they all looked at me. Does that mean you don't want to test fire it then? I just took a deep breath and cradled my aching head. I held out my hand. Just give me that damn button.